I'm putting together a quick review of what I consider some of the highlights of the finances of the San Francisco Public Utilities Commission. And I first became interested in depth. I was always interested, but interested in depth about these finances when I discovered that there was a liquidity fund, or a pooled liquidity fund managed by the treasurer, and the oversight committee is a committee appointed by various entities, but it's under the control of the controller, and a number of people on that so-called oversight committee were on the Revenue Bond Oversight Committee, and I felt were extremely counterproductive to the goals that I felt we enshrined in Proposition P, which created that committee. It's hard to let go of that nearly 10-year experience of being blocked. Anyway, here's the first slide. On the next slide is a summary. So I looked at the year, and this is the total Treasurer's Fund and SFPUC investment in the total in the Treasurer's Fund. So in 2010, the fund was $4.2 billion. These are billions, and they had $1.09 billion, or 25.9%. And it's varied. 2011, the fund was 4.56, and the SFPUC shares were 1.53, and as you can see, the fund has increased to $7.1 billion. The PUC share has gone down to $1.06 billion from 25.91% to 14.95%, although there isn't a great decrease in the absolute amount of the investment. Now, the return on the fund is approximately, or estimated, at 0.78%, and the borrowing cost, like for bonds, varies between 4.5 to 5%, and I have 5% there because this is the assumption for borrowing that the SFPUC makes in their rate model. I hope that this is not too distracting, that noise, but I do live in the city. And here is the source document from which I worked out those summary amounts. Here they are. I just transposed this. But you can see here that they have the dates and the various amounts. And I took the averages for each year based on, like in 2015, I just averaged these amounts. I could do a weighted average later, but I think that this is accurate enough. And down here, I looked at all the funds by composition from the various departments. There's the wastewater enterprise, the Hetchy funds, and the PUC water funds. That's quite a lot of money. Again, to summarize, they receive, although anyone that deposits with the fund receives less than 1% on this liquid fund, and the estimate of bond costs ranges between 4.5 and 5%. I'm going to discuss revenue bonds right now, and the SFPUC has issued a lot of revenue bonds, and the discussion is, are they being used prudently? But first of all, let's talk about how revenue bonds fit into the revenue requirements equation to establish rates. Rates must be set such that they recover sufficient revenue to cover all reasonable costs. Now, under Proposition 218, 1996, reasonable costs don't mean costs that are not applicable to the current customer. They're costs for current output to be used by the current customer. They can't be for any other reason. They can't be used to subsidize one customer at the expense of another. Actually, under Proposition 218, as affirmed in 2006 by the Bighorn decision, water, wastewater, and garbage collections by local governments are special taxes, and special tax revenues are very limited as their application. One of the reasons that a lot of the tier rate structures are being thrown out is that they don't do that. They tend to, in San Luis, San Juan Capistrano, the judges could see no relationship between costs and the tiers. In fact, they said the tiers just seemed to be mathematically convenient and did not correlate with costs. So they threw out some of the upper tiers, and that's for another discussion. Anyway, if we come down here to the equation used in the local government entities, it's very simple. Revenues must cover operating and maintenance costs, tax equivalents. I don't think we do that though, but and debt service, and internal capital charges, which, if you use your money, it's an opportunity for gone, and that's from revenues. Debt service has two normal components to it. In a debt, like in a mortgage, you pay off some of the principal and you pay interest. And so I got this book, and I can give you the reference for it. It's on my website. So let's take that, so I can get that down, and I'll pull up Now, let's take an example of how this works. Here, let us assume that you build a project, that you actually have a very good plan, and in 3 years you build a new facility which enhances current customer services. So you may spend $300,000 the first year, $400,000 next, $100,000. So you capitalize, and you may borrow. Let's assume you borrow this money. So if you capitalize $300,000 for 3 years, it's $390,000, and so forth until you sum these, and you get this amount of $1,041,808. Then that goes into I have a program that does that. Goes into the program as the principal, and the interest. If we assume that the interest is 4.5% and the term is 30%, I put that into my equation. It works out a level annualized factor and multiplies it by the principal. Level annualized factor is just a way of creating an annuity out of a present value or present worth. In other words, the present worth is this, and the annuity is here. See these same payments all the time. And the two components of the annuity are interest, and the interest gets less and less, and the principal amount gets more and more, until finally the principal has been completely recovered, and this is and you can see how the principal decreases, the remaining principal. And so if you pay now for what you put in service, this is what you'll pay. The same as here. But if you pay just the interest, you pay only 46,881 a year, because you're just paying interest, and you're not decreasing the principal. In other words, you're pushing the debt into the future, on the future generations. Proposition 218, and I say this is going to become big in our local government utility life, does not like that fact. So here's just the difference between one and the other. I just worked that out. So if you assume that this project, when it goes into service, will create a marginal cost on current output. And what is that? So you look at current output, assume it's 1 million units, and you divide 1 million units, that's the denominator, into the numerator, and you come out of a marginal cost per unit. And that's the way it should be done. Let's look at how our colleagues are doing it, and you make the decision. Here, it's not going. There it is. Here is the chart they gave me, and you can see that going across very carefully. Here's the type of bond, sales type, where they had insurance, original par, the true interest. Now, I don't agree with their true interest, because their average interest, I mean down here, all they did was take the sum of these true interests, but you've got to weight them volumetrically by the size of the issuance. In other words, you can take all the issues and they come to the par amount, and they can contribute a certain percent, and then you're weighted by the particular bond amount they paid at that time. Here we go. It's impossible to do anything for a long time around here without hearing fire engines. So you can see here's their outstanding interest. Just on the water alone, they've issued 4.9 billion, but they still have a debt of 4.318 billion. And this is the same with the wastewater program and with the Hechechi, that's the power division. And the total debt, exclusive of these amounts, they've issued debt for 6.6 billion, and they have outstanding still 5.4 billion to pay off. And so I summarize these charges, and this is a fairly sophisticated model, not sophisticated, but in other words, for each debt service, I went through and level annualized it. In other words, rather than looking at interest only, I created that annuity out of the present value, that's the amount of the par value of the issuance, and I figured out what the original term was. I figured out how long since the date of issuance, and then I figured out what should remain using that model which I referred to over here. And it gave me some very interesting results. In other words, they should only have 3.7 billion outstanding at this time that they've got to pay off. But they're stating 4.1 billion, and then I had a discrepancy with the interest they're paying. So I summarized these amounts by looking at what the cost would be using of their infrastructure versus mine. It would be less, and this just shows that I think they overcalculated interest, and they're pushing too much debt into the future. and I think they will run afoul of our proposition 218. Let's see if I got the other. No, I don't. Okay, that's enough for now. Then I'll end this section.